Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's, as always, a pleasure to see you here. My name's Jamie Davis, and I have the great pleasure of organising this series of Our Changing World lectures. Those of you who've been coming to all of the lectures will know that we've gone through already many subjects, from theology to physics to geography to aspects of crime and punishment and so forth. And tonight we take another turn towards migration and the crisis of political trust. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Christina Boswell, who is going to give the lecture tonight. She is the Director of Research in the School of Social and Political Sciences. She had her first degree from Balliol College in Oxford, got an MA from Bruges, and then a PhD in International Relations from LSE. She spent time being a field officer for the United Nations Commission for Refugees, and has worked for the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. So she has practical experience of a lot of this. She has worked as a postdoc for 6 years in an institute for migration research in Germany, and joined this university in 2006, where she climbed very rapidly to become a professor in 2011. She is founder of the Centre for Science, Knowledge and Policy, whose logo is up there. And this year, her great contribution to Scotland's academic life was recognised by her election to being a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which, as I'm sure you know, is a very, very high honour in this country. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Christina.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here tonight and be part of this fascinating, really stimulating series of lectures as part of the Our Changing World series. So the starting point of my lecture tonight is an observation about what's widely perceived as a decline or even a crisis in political trust in advanced liberal democracies. Now, trust is a willingness to bestow authority or resources on other people to act on our behalf. And a key aspect of bestowing trust on political leaders, on politicians, involves our beliefs about their motivations. So what motivates our politicians? Can we trust their motives? Do we trust them to represent our interests, to represent the public interest? And just by way of example, if we look at some of the survey data on public trust in politicians, we see, for example, do you think that British politicians are out merely for themselves, for their party, or to do the best for their country? And we see here, obviously, a steady decline since the 1940s in the belief that politicians are out to do the best for their country, and an increase in the proportion of respondents who consider that they're out for themselves. And this is just indicative of there are a wide range of polls and survey data which indicate this increased scepticism, lack of trust, and broadly speaking, disaffection in political institutions and political leaders. We can also look at this from another angle and see how this declining trust or declining confidence in mainstream political institutions is illustrated in a rise in support for populist parties. So there's an increasing rejection of mainstream parties in favour of populist parties on the left, but more particularly on the right. And here, for example, we have data gathered by Inglehart and Norris, which shows, crudely speaking, shows trends in voting patterns for populist parties in different countries. Now, obviously, this kind of data comes with various caveats. It's very difficult to do a systematic comparison of populist party support in different countries because, of course, they all have different electoral systems. It may be more or less challenging for populist parties to break through and gain a high proportion of votes, depending on the electoral system of the country. But if you look at the last 3 bars on each of these charts, so since the 1990s through the 2000s and the 2010s, generally speaking, with a couple of exceptions, Greece, for example, we see this rise in the proportion of voters who are supporting populist parties. Now, immigration is often associated with this increasing support for populist parties and more generally with increased mistrust and disaffection with mainstream political system. And it's easy to see why this association would be made if we look at issues which are considered salient or the most important issues facing different countries, and this is Eurobarometer data which looks at the EU as a whole, so this aggregates across EU countries. We can see that immigration has clearly become much more important. To be sure, we do see a small dip there, 2016, but you can see that grey line of immigration is very clearly becoming the number one issue in terms of salience importance across EU countries. And interestingly here as well, you can see first of all a decline in the importance of some of those traditional issues that often vex voters. So we're all familiar with that mantra, it's the economy, stupid. Well, it appears that it's not the economy, stupid, it's actually immigration and terrorism which are of more concern to voters than those classic issues. And those classic issues around the distribution of economic resources, so issues around unemployment, issues around the economic situation are being overridden by concerns about issues like immigration and terrorism. And of course, these sorts of issues are very much associated in particular with right-wing populist parties. Now, insofar as we might see support for Brexit as a symptom of a populist movement, but that might be a controversial claim and one has to be very careful and guarded with what one says about Brexit issues in the current political climate. But here, for example, if we look at the main issues motivating Brexit supporters, for example, we see that immigration comes out as the strongest. You see the blue bars there indicate that the most important issues motivating the voting decisions of those who voted for Brexit. And you see things like the traditional economic issues, well, the economy in general seem to be an important issue for Remain voters, but less so for those voting Brexit. So clearly, immigration is a very salient issue and one that appears to be motivating support for far-right parties and support for issues like Brexit. Now, this is an interesting and very striking graph because it seems to suggest that there's a correlation between the salience of immigration issues for the British public, so how important they see immigration as a political issue, and net migration figures. So as you can see here, that grey, the paler grey line represents trends in net migration to the UK. And you're probably familiar with that measurement of net migration. It's basically immigration minus out-migration. So it's the balance of the net figure of migrants coming to the UK. So it's flows of migrants, net flows of migrants. And you can see that there seems to be an interesting correspondence between those two lines on the graph. So it does seem to be, in particular, when you get a quite substantial rise in the level of immigration, round about, well, late 90s, early 2000s, and you see quite a substantial, slightly lagged, but substantial rise in the political salience of immigration as well. So we'd be forgiven for thinking that given this kind of correlation and given the importance of immigration issues in motivating support for the far right, that support for populist movements, support for far-right movements, and the general rejection of mainstream politics is not unrelated to immigration. So there seems to be some kind of link between anti-immigrant sentiment, changes in trends in immigration to the UK, and let's say more generally, rise of support for populism and disaffection with mainstream politics. Immigration seems to have become the number one societal concern, prompting people to reject mainstream parties and mainstream politics. But here we have to take a pause and think about how we might start disentangling this relationship between immigration, political trust, and support for populist movements. And let's start off by posing this question. Has immigration, as I've just intimated, or we might intuitively think of, based on the kinds of trends that I've just been very roughly outlining, has immigration led to political disaffection, or is immigration instead a channel for other sorts of concerns? And it's often been observed that immigration serves as a channel, a vent, a lightning rod, if you like, for other types of social, economic, and cultural problems. So clearly it's a very complex relationship which needs some kind of unpacking. And it's not just an academic question, because depending on how we answer this question, there are quite important practical implications for how politicians should respond to concerns about immigration and political disaffection more generally. So if immigration is a cause of support for populist parties, rejection of the political mainstream, if it's a general cause of political disaffection, then one might infer that the solution would be to address those concerns, to allay public concerns by complying with public preferences on immigration and simply restricting immigration. And that certainly seems to be the type of direction taken by UK government following the vote for Brexit, for example, and indeed since 2010 when David Cameron set a net migration target of reducing immigration from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands. There seems to be a recognition that the public clearly favour restriction, and what we need to do then as politicians, as political leaders, is to address those concerns, allay public concerns by restricting immigration. Immigration. If it's not that straightforward, the causal link between immigration and public concerns, if immigration is a channel or event for other types of underlying problems, well then we need to tackle the underlying causes of those problems if we can do so. And so getting tough on immigration won't necessarily address those underlying causes. So whatever we do to try to restrict immigration may not actually have an effect on the types of malaise, anxieties which are generating anti-immigrant sentiment. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this lecture is to try to unpack this question in two stages. It should be two stages, but that automatic formatting, which we all love in PowerPoint, has produced a number one and a number one. That should be a number one and a number two. So first of all, I'm going to unpack a bit the relationship between immigration and political disaffection, and then I'm going to think about the consequences of that for policy and political debate. So I'm going to take as a starting point, when trying to understand the relationship between immigration and political affection, three different ways of explaining political disaffection and growing mistrust in politics. And they can broadly be defined as material, cultural, and processual, or to do with processes. And I'm going to go through each one in turn and consider what implications it might have for understanding that relationship between immigration and political disaffection. Now, the most common explanation for anti-immigrant sentiment, and the one that will be probably most familiar to Guardian readers, as there's a comment piece setting out this kind of argument pretty much once a week, featuring in the Guardian, is what we could call the material account. So this focuses very much on the deterioration in socio-economic conditions for sections of the population, especially since the 1970s. So the argument runs, there's been growing inequality, so a rising poverty gap between the haves and have-nots. Forms of employment have become increasingly precarious, zero hours contracts, instability of contracts, low wages, etc. So forming what's often called the precariat, this group of the population which is sort of existing just about on very, very precarious contracts, often holding down multiple jobs and very short-term employment. We've seen stagnating wages, So the sort of economic boom and the expectation of continued economic growth of the 1950s and 60s has not been redeemed since the 70s and 80s. And we're seeing this divide between these urban hubs where we have dynamic economies and these post-industrial areas which are often labelled economic backwaters, where people are disillusioned, there isn't a huge amount of investment, and so on. And so disaffection with politics and anti-immigration sentiment are associated with those who are most clearly definable as the victims of these types of socio-economic conditions. So how would that relate to anti-immigration sentiment? Well, there would be two ways of trying to draw this link. The first would be to say that these types of socio-economic problems are caused by large-scale immigration. So arguably one could argue that immigrants either displace native workers on the labour market, so they take jobs from immigrants who are competing for scarce employment in often low-skilled sectors, or the argument can run that they depress the wages, because obviously if you expand the supply of migrants for particular occupations, classical economics would suggest that then wages will come down. So those are kind of arguments which suggest that these types of economic problems are caused by high levels of immigration. Or alternatively, you could argue that those who are in these precarious jobs, who are victims of rising inequality, living in these economic backwaters, are feeling resentful, they're feeling frustrated, and they're anxious about scarce resources, scarce employment opportunities, economic instability more generally, and that they channel that socioeconomic uncertainty into resentment about immigrants, about newcomers. So we can argue it either way. Now, research has largely debunked the idea that immigrants are a burden on the public purse. So there's quite extensive and robust research, for example, from Christian Dussmann and his colleagues at UCL, which shows that actually immigrants are not more of a burden on the public purse than UK nationals. And indeed, if you look at EEA immigrants, they actually contribute more on average to in tax contributions than they take out in welfare resources and social services. So it's not evident that immigration poses an economic burden in this aspect. There isn't a clear link between immigration and unemployment. There's no evidence or substantial evidence that there is a displacement effect, that immigrants take jobs from native workers. In fact, immigration is often responsive to labour shortages. So where there's a labour shortage and where there are large numbers of vacancies and so on, that tends to be a pull factor for immigrants. And immigrants are often complementary in terms of their skills and job preferences to native workers. So there doesn't seem to be evidence of a displacement effect. The jury is out to some extent on whether immigration can depress salaries. So most of the research until fairly recently suggested that there's only a negligible effect of immigration on salaries. And that could be argued in either direction, that it could actually enhance salaries, especially for higher skilled occupations. More recently, a Bank of England study suggested, well, that there is if you look by region and by occupation, a substantial increase in immigration can lead to a slight reduction in salaries, and that's average wages, so that takes into account also that immigrants might come in on very low salaries, so that's an average rather than looking at the effect just on native wages. So the jury's out there. But in general, we don't see substantial evidence for immigration causing the types of socioeconomic problems that I've just indicated. But that doesn't mean to say that immigration or that inequality and these material factors, socioeconomic equality and so on, are not a driver of support for anti-immigration sentiment. Because as we've seen, obviously, other types of socioeconomic anxieties and so on, and concern about employment and so on, can be channeled into concern about immigrants, whether or not they are actually, in fact, the cause of those types of problems. But here is interesting research, again going back to Engelhardt and Norris, who've done some really interesting research on this, and they have suggested that actually those who are the most or the greatest victims of socioeconomic inequality, so those coming from the most deprived, the least wealthy social classes and segments of the population, are not the most likely to vote for populist parties. In fact, populist party support is predominantly or more significantly derived from lower middle class and as opposed to those on more precarious types of contracts. So it's not that straightforward that socioeconomic concerns drive anti-immigrant sentiment. So this takes us on to a second set of theories. So I think what we can say in summary about this first set of theories about the causes of anti-immigrant sentiment is socioeconomic concerns and the material account does not seem to be a particularly reliable predictor of support for populist parties and anti-immigrant sentiment more generally. Engelhardt and Norris argue it's not the economy, that's not the main driver of anti-immigrant sentiment, that cultural factors are much more important. So they, through extensive studying of electoral election results and voting patterns, have produced findings which suggest that a large population or a large proportion of the population voting for populist parties tend to be white, male, older segments of the population who feel culturally alienated by a shift in values in wider society. And the types of cultural shift or value shifts which are so threatening and alienating to certain groups of the population are linked to globalization and the increased diversification of the population in terms of ethnicity, new social movements which are seen as threatening more traditional, small c conservative values, rise in environmental and green movements, women's rights, LGBT rights, and more generally cultural change, so that those who are so-called culturally left behind don't feel recognized or valued, given these big cultural shifts that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. They have a sense that there's a liberal elite in power which is essentially condescending towards them, sneering at their values and their lifestyle. They don't feel recognized, they don't feel valued, they feel alienated in their social context. So where does immigration fit into this account? Again, one could argue it either way. One could argue that it's the fact of ethnic diversity, large-scale immigration over the last 20, 30 years has created what's often called super diversity in many of our cities, and has also brought about change in some of the post-industrial and rural areas as well. For example, in the UK, immigration is fairly widely distributed across different parts of the UK, and that diversity is alienating elements of the so-called native population, making them feel that they're not at home anymore in their own country. So that's one way of looking at it. Or again, one could argue that socio-cultural anxiety is not caused by an increase in diversity and immigration, but it's being channeled into anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, interestingly, if we look, let's go back to the Brexit vote. If we look at the Brexit vote, and we saw that a predominant motivation for voting Brexit was concern about immigration, and we identify which areas of the country voted in highest numbers or highest proportions for Brexit, we see it's not predominantly in those areas with the highest levels of immigration, inner London being the most obvious example right there, up there as, you know, having a high concentration of immigrants and having a very high concentration of Remain voters. Even more revealingly, here we have, on the left, we have percentage of those born abroad, so the distribution and concentration of non-national or foreign-born population in different parts of England and Wales compared to the likelihood of supporting UKIP. And we can see actually that these concentrations do not match each other very well. So I think two things to observe here. First is it's not the urban conglomerates with high proportions of immigration which are most likely to produce UKIP voters. It's actually people clustered in what one might term backwaters, or sometimes in rural areas or areas which have not been as substantially affected by immigration. And secondly, of course, that there's not a clear correlation between the level of immigration and anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, bear in mind, though, that this kind of assumed, or this dismissal of a correlation between the concentration of immigrants or foreign-born and anti-immigrant sentiment is quite crude in a sense. So many people point out that actually it's a change in the level of immigration rather than absolute numbers of immigration which can cause anxiety about foreigners. If, for example, you live in an area which has very limited experience of diversity or immigration and you see a substantial change in that area, which might not result in a particularly dense concentration of foreign-born, but nonetheless there's change and there's churn and there's upheaval, then that can actually produce quite a lot of anxiety and it can be associated with support for populist movements as well as anti-immigrant sentiment. So it's not necessarily the concentration, it's often the change which is more significant. But I think this discussion of these two sets of theories, and for both of them, for the material and the cultural theory, we have this, in a sense, question around, are the material or the cultural changes linked to migration responsible for these sorts of anxieties, or are they just the channel for these anxieties? In a way, I think this raises a much more interesting question about where do we get our knowledge from immigration from. So on the one hand, people can have direct observations and experiences of immigration in their daily lives. They can see signs of ethnic diversity as they walk down their high street. They might have personal interactions with people from different backgrounds and so on. But a lot of the knowledge that people produce about immigration and its effects are coming from conversations with friends or family, anecdotes. When I talk to people about where they get knowledge about certain types of behaviours or dynamics of immigration, they often have anecdotes about a friend of theirs or a cousin of theirs who knows a family who, etc. So that's one source of knowledge. Obviously the media coverage is a very important source of knowledge about immigration, and so is political discourse. So what politicians say about immigration can have a substantial impact on our values and beliefs around questions of immigration. So in an area as complex as immigration, there's no direct or pure way of observing facts about immigration. We might observe certain types of changes around us which might or might not be linked to immigration, but there are various more or less entrenched narratives about immigration which influence how we interpret and give meaning to these observations about what we see around us. So we develop or construct narratives of social problems, including immigration, basically stories about the causes and dynamics of these sorts of issues, what sorts of people are coming to our country, what impacts they have, and these narratives are constructed or produced drawing on various sources of knowledge which do not directly derive from our experiences or our observation of raw facts, as it were. And in developing these types of narratives, we rely to a large extent on, let's say, pretty entrenched background ideas or public philosophies about the nature of immigration, the nature of foreigners, about our national identity, about what sort of society we want to live in. So, for example, in the UK, typical public philosophies around immigration on the negative side would be things like a concern about welfare scroungers, a concern about Britain being too full, a concern about queue jumping. These are very typical ways in which we channel and think about the negative effects of immigration. If you think about a country like Germany, immigration or anti-immigration concerns are often channeled in quite a different way. They're often channeled into concerns about unemployment, about integration, and about the Muslim population in Germany. So there's no clear-cut way in which a change in something like the level of immigration to a country would reliably produce objective knowledge about immigration. The way we produce knowledge is, first of all, very much shaped by these kinds of narratives about what kind of social problem it is, and those narratives in turn are profoundly influenced by the sort of deep background ideas, the worldviews, the public philosophies which have developed over many years and which shape how we think about immigration in our country. And I'm going to touch on this again at the end, but this does imply that those who are leading debates and those who are shaping public discourse on these narratives and tapping these public philosophies have a huge amount of influence over how we construct immigration, whether we see it as a problem. Now, I just briefly touch on a third way of thinking about the sources of disaffection and anti-immigrant sentiment, what that implies for anti-immigrant sentiment. And that's thinking about political process. So there's a very interesting literature in political science about how we've become increasingly disillusioned with the process of politics. Politics is very complex, it's often very convoluted, it can be quite opaque. And we can't always see how reliably our inputs, in the sense of voting or supporting a particular party or a politician, get translated into outputs which we would support. And I'm going to explain a bit about this. So we're often told we're living in a post-ideological era, which basically means party positions are not straightly delineated in terms of left-wing and right-wing, where left-wing was for more distributive, more progressive distributive positions on socioeconomic resources, and right-wing was more for stability in the status quo. Instead, in a post-ideological context, party political positions are often determined by more technocratic views about how best to steer the economy, how best to intervene to address different types of social problems. So in a sense, the answers to some of the complex challenges facing our society are not about ideological and value-based arguments on redistribution. They're about how to steer risk and to protect the population against certain types of risk. And how to steer very, very complex social and economic systems in a way to produce outcomes which actually, by and large, we would all be signed up to. So, for example, there's not a substantial ideological difference, for example, on economic policy, on many aspects of public service provision and so on, but the difference is about how best we achieve generally agreed goals. So in the context of that post-ideological context, a lot of decision-making around politics is about these kind of technocratic, quite complex aspects of how best to intervene to steer these processes. And the types of actors involved in policy making have become increasingly complex and diverse. So on the one hand, you have multi-level governance where different aspects of policy are elaborated and implemented at the local level, at the devolved government level, at the UK national level, at the EU level, in some areas at the international level. And there's a plethora of actors, public sector, private sector, agencies, various types of actors involved in delivering public services of different types. So again, we have this sort of huge complexity of the process of decision-making and implementation. And this crisis, at the same time, we have two trends in the dynamics of politics which have engendered cynicism about the political process. So on the one hand, we have this dynamic of party political competition, which is very difficult to avoid, where parties basically have to set out their wares in an appealing way to maximise votes by sort of, in a sense, outbidding each other by promising more and more appealing types of outcomes, setting pledges and targets and so on. And that bidding war is bound to lead to disappointment as politicians fail to deliver on what they've promised. At the same time, we have increased media cynicism about the process of politics, which again contributes to voter cynicism about politicians. And we get, as a result, as an upshot of these various types of processes, we get what's often seen as this crisis of representation, the notion that we're not getting what we voted for. So politicians promise us one thing, and then because of this complexity of delivering that, the opacity, the kind of difficulty of trying to predict voting behaviour, or to, in a sense, trace the process from voting for a particular position to a particular policy outcome has become more opaque and convoluted, so we don't feel we're being properly represented. And so this is a source of our decline of trust for politicians. We see elites as out of touch, they're failing to deliver on what they promise. And in this context, how does immigration fit into this? Well, failure to deliver on immigration goals might be seen as a symptom of this broader problem. Governments just aren't delivering on their promises. They're not redeeming public preferences. Now, one example of this in the area of immigration, and this is something I've done quite a bit of research on myself. I led an ESRC project looking at net migration and other targets in immigration, and looking at their effects on public debate and on media coverage. But if we look, for example, at newspaper coverage of the net migration target, which was announced by David Cameron in 2010, we see that initially most of the media coverage was about whether they supported the target or not, and there was a fair bit of support for the target, a fair bit of criticism of the target across 11 of the most widely read media newspaper outlets. But as time went on and it became evident that the government wasn't meeting its net migration target, we see increasing scepticism. So media coverage is dominated by scepticism about the target. Scepticism that it's a viable target, that it can be met. Scepticism about the motives of government for setting this target, which doesn't seem meetable. So we get increasing cynicism and mistrust in government's ability and willingness to implement this target. And here we just have a tracking of Ipsos Mori monthly polls on the best party on immigration and asylum issue, and we see that notwithstanding the Conservative Party's very robust commitment to the net migration target, we see declining confidence of the public that the Conservatives are the best equipped to handle immigration, and we see the purple line there, a rise in support for UKIP, quite radical rise in support from 2013. So this is an example of how the public is frustrated with the process of politics and isn't, we're seeing a decline in confidence in the government's ability to meet public preferences. So I've set out three different ways of understanding this relationship between immigration and political trust, looking at material sources, looking at cultural sources, and looking at the process of politics and how that has spawned disillusionment, and thinking about what those three theories say for the causes of anti-immigrant sentiment. So let's think now about the consequences of these types of arguments for policy and political debate. So just briefly to recap, now I'm aware that none of these three theories offers a clear and complete answer to our question about what are the causes of political disaffection and how that relates to anti-immigrant sentiment. But I think what we can infer from that brief overview of these three theories is, first of all, political disaffection isn't just about socioeconomic issues. It's also about cultural alienation, and it's exacerbated by problems of the political process, so frustration at the political process. Politics is disappointing. So probably some mix of those three theories. Now, is immigration itself the cause of this alienation? Not in any straightforward way. Rapid change and increased diversity in some areas can contribute to a sense of cultural alienation. But we shouldn't forget the role of narratives here. So stories about the nature of the problem of immigration and about the effects of immigration, which are obviously constructed through a variety of different sources, whether it's interpersonal interactions with friends and relatives, whether it's media sources, whether it's political rhetoric. And these narratives in turn tap public philosophies or entrenched collective ideas about society, about membership and identity, and so on. So how, given this analysis so far, how should politics respond to the problem? So I'm again, because these things always come in threes, I'm going to indicate three different types of response and just briefly discuss the pros and cons. So the first response will be a kind of simple democratic model on which, well, if preferences or voter preferences are clearly in favour of restricting immigration, then politicians should represent voter preferences, and that there's obviously a moral justification for doing that, insofar as we believe that politicians should represent their voters. It does raise some issues about who voters should represent. Should they also represent or defend the interests of ethnic minorities as against majorities who might have certain preferences for immigration restriction? Should they also represent residents who don't vote? But okay, let's bracket that out and say, well, there might be a case for this simple democratic model where politicians should represent voter preferences. There might well be a pragmatic argument for why politicians should articulate and represent the concerns of voters to avoid a kind of pent-up sort of situation in which these issues become taboo and voters aren't allowed to express their frustration and concerns about these issues. And again, pragmatically, often a mainstream sort of capture of these issues or mainstream representation of anti-immigrant sentiment is often justified on the basis of it will prevent the rise of populist parties, which are more nefarious. So if we in the mainstream manage to embrace and engage with these types of voter concerns, then we'll prevent this shift to the far right. That's certainly a very predominant argument in Germany, but also across European countries we have that argument for why centre-right parties should embrace immigration issues. But here I go back to some of those points about how we construct knowledge and how we understand the effects, the dynamics and effects of immigration, that this is not something which is just produced from observing the facts of immigration. It's something which is very much constructed through different sources of knowledge and different inputs into the debate. So in that context, politicians don't simply passively channel public attitudes, they actively shape them. By articulating, by deploying different narratives about social problems, politicians, political leaders, and the media are changing our perceptions of those problems. So they can crystallize or consolidate anti-immigrant sentiment. They can foreground particular aspects of immigration as a social problem, and they can render legitimate views which might otherwise have been discredited. They can bring these kinds of views into the mainstream, and they can make them what the Germans call salonfähig, which kind of means ideas which you can kind of legitimately raise at a dinner party discussion. And I think that's been very clear in the context of the Brexit referendum and some of the debates about immigration. So that notorious UKIP poster in general, campaigning from UKIP in particular, but also parts of the Conservative Party, and post-Brexit. I mean, I'm not going to say there's a kind of direct causal link, but I think post-Brexit, the rise in hate crime and more generally the rise in the sense that it's respectable and legitimate to articulate quite strong anti-immigrant sentiment seems to have some source in this change in what's considered, let's say, viable way of talk, or a kind of legitimate way of talking about immigration on the part of political elites. So it has effect. It's what sociologists call performative. It's not simply descriptive. What about the other, in a sense, the other extreme, which is to say, well, the voters are simply wrong. There are these, misconceptions about the impacts of immigration. People think it's an economic burden, but it's not. It's very good for the economy. We need to bust the myths. We need to put people right. And we need to disseminate research and persuade people of the economic benefits of immigration. And I've got a picture of Tony Blair up there with a CBI logo in the background, because in the early 2000s, it's incredible to think that this was only about, sort of 1.5 decades ago. Blair's government was very actively making the case for the economic benefits of immigration and trying to justify an expanded or liberalisation of labour migration policy based on arguments about how it benefited the economy. But the problem is it's not really about the facts. And going back to some of the arguments that I was conveying when we were talking about sort of socioeconomic effects of immigration, it's not really about whether immigrants do or don't displace native workers. It's not really about whether they depress salaries or whether they're a burden on the public purse. It's about people's perceptions of immigration and how do people produce those perceptions. Again, we're back to those sources of knowledge, interpersonal relations, exchanges, communications, the media, and politicians. So it's a lot more complex than simply persuading people about the economic impacts of immigration, plus which, as the cultural account tells us, it's not necessarily about the economy anyway. It's also about the sort of cultural change and people feeling alienated and left behind by cultural change. Not least, I think Gove really put his finger on a certain pulse here, this idea that we've had enough of experts. So again, on the cultural thesis, this chimes very much with this idea that those who are culturally left behind feel patronised, they feel that they're being lectured and looked down on, and so often that kind of lecturing about the economic benefits can be counterproductive. So we've discussed two different approaches, in a sense opposite approaches. One is the democratic representation. We should comply with what we see as public preferences in this area, and the other approach is to say, no, we should persuade the electorate that they're wrong, immigration is good, especially good for the economy, and I've suggested that both are quite problematic. So what about a third approach, which we could term something along the lines of, well, politicians should show leadership in this area. There are many ways to talk about immigration. Again, as I've mentioned, there are social problems such as immigration are not straightforwardly derived from observation of facts, but they are channeled through different types of narratives about the nature of this problem, and they're very much influenced by public philosophies around things like fairness, around identity, around membership, and so on. Now, any society has multiple public philosophies. In the UK, I mentioned some of the ideas which have, in a sense, channeled or shaped anti-immigrant sentiment, issues around scarce welfare resources and queue jumping and ideas of fairness and so on. But obviously there are also strong strands around a history of, or at least self-defined history of tolerance, diversity, the value of multiculturalism and so on. And these are the types of ideas that Tony Blair and his government tapped in the early 2000s when they were making the case for a more positive and a more liberal immigration policy. Now, leaders can select which strands of public philosophy they want to foreground, and they can deploy those to try to build support for particular approaches. So there's quite a lot of autonomy, although in some ways we're kind of constrained by the sort of deeply entrenched ideas which shape how we think about society. There are a range of different strands in public philosophy which can be evoked to try to justify and mobilize support for particular positions. And I think one of the key things, I mean, I've got the picture of Angela Merkel here because, I mean, it's clear that this is an example of somebody who, in the summer of 2015, exercised considerable political leadership and tapped into particular strands of German public philosophy around a humanitarian duty, around respect for human rights, and so on. There's another aspect of this. So I think political leadership is about tapping aspects of public philosophies and galvanizing support for particular values which might justify perhaps a more progressive approach. But I also think that there's a role for having a more frank debate on immigration. And there is a picture of Rita Süssmuth, who's a CDU politician in Germany, who chaired a cross-party immigration committee in the early 2000s. And I think this commission is very interesting because it came at a juncture where there was quite a sort of strident and fraught debate in Germany about which way to go in immigration policy. We had a SPD and a Green coalition government that wanted to liberalise labour migration, and we had a conservative opposition which resisted that liberalisation. And Schröder set up a cross-party immigration commission which looked at all aspects of immigration. It looked at labour migration, it looked at asylum and refugee policy, it looked at approaches to integration, and it brought in the main political parties. It also brought in representatives from different NGOs, unions and employer groups, the churches. It drew on expert knowledge, which it commissioned across these different issues. And through this debate, in a sense, a lot of anxieties about immigration across sectors of German society were aired and were articulated, but at the same time, there was quite a lot of debate about the different impacts of immigration, about the economic and demographic impacts of immigration, about how best to handle integration and diversity. And in a sense, I think one of the fruits of this cross-party commission was a recognition by around, well, it came out of the report, but by around the mid-2000s, if you look at political discourse on immigration in Germany, you see a normalization of the idea that Germany is a country of immigration, that immigration is inevitable, that what we can do is to manage it and to try to promote integration, to try to mitigate the possible negative effects of immigration, but we have to, in a sense, embrace it but manage it in a way that best suits our society and our culture. And that, to me, seems to be a really good example of political leadership in this area. Now, I mentioned Scotland, obviously, because many of us are very interested in Scottish politics, follow Scottish politics. But Scotland is an example of, first of all, a country where the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is one of the few politicians who has been vocally committed to making a case for the positive benefits of immigration, but also, I think more interestingly, that all of the main political parties are broadly in favour of sustaining levels of immigration to Scotland, certain levels of immigration to Scotland, in order to address demographic problems. But it can be very difficult for individual political parties or politicians to, in a sense, stick their neck out and explain the complexity around issues of immigration. On the one hand, acknowledging the fact that many people are concerned about the cultural effects of immigration, but also explaining how immigration impacts on the economy, impacts on society, often in very positive ways, and in a sense discussing the issue in the round in a frank way without going to one polar position or the other. So to wrap up, I was exploring issues around the crisis of political trust and disaffection in the UK in particular, but this is also symptomatic in many Western and advanced liberal democracies. And I was trying to unpack the role of immigration in this decline in political trust and disaffection. So there are no clear-cut answers to this question, but what I've tried to argue is that immigration hasn't caused or hasn't been a central cause of a crisis of political trust. It may have partially contributed to a feeling of cultural alienation amongst certain sections of the population, but there are broader cultural and socioeconomic changes, as well as disillusionment with the political process, which in a sense can be characterised as deeper socioeconomic and cultural and political causes of this disaffection, that immigration is not a primary cause of declining political trust. And in a sense, to talk about this question of whether immigration causes or is a channel for or event for these types of underlying anxieties is in some way misleading, because knowledge and ideas about immigration don't just emerge from the facts of this social phenomenon. They're given meaning by their fit with predominant and compelling narratives about social problems, which in turn are animated by underlying public philosophies. So in a sense, the raw data on immigration don't produce or don't directly bring about certain types of attitudes towards immigration, but what matters is how this data is given meaning depending on these different narratives and depending on these public philosophies and shared ideas. Now, that account has important implications for what is to be done politically, because it does imply that these views or beliefs about immigration are not set in stone. It implies some malleability, some flexibility in how we think about immigration, and political leaders have substantial scope to shape the ways in which we discuss and talk about immigration, which values we invoke to guide our responses. They have an important role in constructing social problems. But I've also suggested that it does take courage to talk frankly about these types of issues. And so I think cross-party consensus or processes which buy in different parties across the political spectrum, or at least mainstream parties across this political spectrum, are probably the most promising way of encouraging a more frank debate about immigration, about its costs and its benefits, about how the types of concerns that people have about immigration and the types of benefits it brings to our society. And I would suggest that there is a really fruitful set of conditions which would enable that kind of debate in Scotland. Thank you very much.
It's going back to the beginning of your lecture, particularly the first, when you was going over the first two graphs. I did notice that the trend between the importance between the terrorism and the immigration as it progressed up, there was very much together the entire way through. Yet then, when we went on to the next slide, I noticed that the reasons behind Brexit votes were substantially lower on the issues of terrorism as they were on immigration. Now, obviously, I understand that immigration's obviously going to be represented in that way because it's coming from abroad as it is anyway. But what I don't understand is, particularly, that was another point as well, it was based on white British opinion, and I would personally class myself as British as well, but I've got a dual heritage. So what I wondered was why the data had only been pulled from white British, particularly.
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I suppose one simple way of explaining the first part of your question is that this is about Brexit support and this is EU as a whole. And I think we might infer from that, and that would not be without certain grounds, that fear of terrorism in certain continental countries has become really pronounced and has risen because of a number of terrorist attacks over the last couple of years. So that would be one way of answering that. But as you also yourself inferred, although there was perhaps a sort of general concern about the refugee crisis in Europe and how that might or might not be linked to EU membership, and there was a lot of confusion about that, and frankly some rather disingenuous links drawn in the media between the two, between EEA mobility and the refugee crisis, and terrorism to some extent was linked with the refugee crisis. Generally, it wasn't such a prominent issue in the debate. Now, in terms of why this is broken down to white British, now this was from an article by Eric Kaufman, and as I recall, the argument he was trying to make was trying to identify this particular section of the UK population which is often associated with support for anti-immigrant sentiment and populism. So it wasn't that he's privileging the views of this section of the population, which would be entirely inappropriate and unethical. I think it was more that he's saying it's more typically, and you know, it could well have also, one could imagine this disaggregated by white males over 50 or so. You know, it's that kind of disaggregation of data to try to hone in on that particular social group. But yes, I understand. I mean, the data that I draw, and it's not, most of this is not my own data, so I've borrowed shamelessly from other authors, because this particular issue I've been lecturing on isn't the direct focus of most of my research. I've sort of pulled together bits from different pieces, so imperfect it may be.
Thank you.
Question to begin with, are you an immigrant?
My parents were, and grandparents, I've got immigration background, but
No,
myself,
I meant,
okay, me as an English
Scotland?
person in Scotland,
Yes.
that's a very interesting question.
Boswell, of course, is a well-known Scottish
Well, yeah, but it's
writer, as we
Busweiler,
know.
it's actually, I'm not a real...
That's why I was asking you.
I'm not a
No,
real
I
Boswell,
mean,
though. But
it's
yeah.
frivolous in a way, but actually it's important as well,
Yeah.
because you touched in the last 10 seconds with your little picture of the Scottish leaders of the Scottish dimension, which I would argue, if you're looking for policy alternatives, is different. The fact that, for example, UKIP has never had a base as significant in Scotland as in England, and UKIP effectively became the racist party of the past few years, typically around 4% against 14% in England. The fact that you've had a government, which the SNP government, which has taken a civic nationalism view rather than an ethnic nationalist view, for example, allowing people from other countries living in Scotland to vote on Scottish independence. Interestingly, you may not know, but the majority of Scots born in Scotland voted for independence. They were outweighed by people from England, 400,000, and curiously enough, from the EU, who were worried they were going to be thrown out of Europe, because if Scotland was independent and out of Europe, they would be thrown out of Scotland. So what I'm suggesting is that perhaps more work needs to be done in your policy alternatives on how do we develop a kind of politics that welcomes immigration, welcomes diversity, looks at the economic issues as the Scottish government and the other Scottish parties, to be fair to them, have done, and more work in that. And I don't know whether that's an area which I know you might be looking at a broader perspective, but it's an area, it seems to me, that could be developed much more, because there are some lessons there. You know, the Brexit vote and so on. I know in London the Brexit vote was higher than Scotland, against Brexit, but there are important areas of work there, I would think.
I mean, I think, thanks very much. I mean, I think the issue about, first of all, Scottish political elites and also Scottish public opinion vis-a-vis the rest of the UK is really fascinating. So on the one hand, polling data does show that the Scots are, on average, slightly less anti-immigrant than the average rest of the UK, but obviously if you disaggregate, look at London, for example, or other bits of you know, that's not so clear-cut. But not much so. So Scottish opinion is still predominantly anti-immigration. Political elites, though, this is the real difference, though, political elites, including the Scottish Conservative Party, are largely less anti-immigration and less favourable to mobilisation around those issues. Now, part of that might be something to do with a more progressive political culture, I don't know. Frankly, I think there's a fair amount of self-idealisation that also goes on about the Scots somehow being more progressive and tolerant, because I think part of this is that it's not an issue for which Scotland has devolved competence, of course, so it hasn't become the object of party political competition in the way that, you know, in terms of competing claims about government performance or in this area, and neither has the media particularly been able to focus in on, you know, exposing government failure to manage immigration, etc. This just isn't an issue in Scottish politics in the same way. Were immigration to become a competence in a new devolution settlement, were there to be a decentralization of immigration powers, I suspect that you would actually get a creeping in of more party political competition over this issue as the opposition party seeks to expose government transgressions or inability to deliver in this area, and the media picks up on those debates. And I think that there is a lot of potential in the public. If you talk to MSPs, for example, who through their doorstepping and conversations with voters have picked up on quite substantial anti-immigrant sentiment. So I suppose a sort of mixed response. I think as conditions stand, I do think it's more propitious, and that there might be something about a culture of being an emigration, having its own emigration history, which makes Scotland more progressive and more sympathetic. Having said that, I do think that should those political dynamics change, I wouldn't count your chickens that progressive flavour of the debate would be sustained.
Well, thank you very much for that talk. Well, I found it very interesting what you said about normalization of the German debate on immigration after that immigration commission did start its work. And I was wondering, the one thing was, how do you actually measure normalization in that debate? That was the first question. And the second question was, like, how would you then explain an uprise of populism in Germany?
Yeah,
well,
sure,
obviously there was the refugee crisis, but what could you say about the impact of the work of that immigration commission?
Yeah, so I mean, the research which I've done, published with a colleague, James Hampshire, recently on this, where we looked at political debate, parliamentary debate on immigration issues in Germany and the UK through the 2000s, and it is very clear. I'm going to come to the second bit in a minute, but it's very clear that there was, from around 2003, 2004, there was a discernible shift in the way that immigration is debated in the Bundestag. Also by most CDU, CSU politicians, towards an acceptance that, okay, we're a country of immigration and now we have to address integration. So I'm not saying that this was embraced in a sort of refusive, positive way, but there's clearly a shift, and you can hear this in the rhetoric of also CDU politicians such as Angela Merkel. Okay, whether or not that's sustainable, I mean, that's another question. So I think you can have these moments where you get a shift in a sense, a shift in discourse, which then I think does have an impact on underlying public philosophies of immigration in a particular country. And I think in Germany that was sustained for a number of years and arguably has influenced the Willkommenskultur that we saw around, let's put inverted commas around that because we know it's there is another side to that, around 2015 and so on. Now, first of all, that's not necessarily embraced by all sections of the German electorate, and obviously that doesn't preclude support for far-right parties and a rejection of that. So it was a sort of mainstream party position, and again, arguably that did create an electoral space for a far-right party to exploit the fact that not all Germans agreed with that. So I'm not saying it's a perfect consensus, and I'm not saying it's necessarily robust enough to be sustained through quite difficult and tumultuous times in terms of refugee influx into Germany. But it's something, okay? And it does make a difference. And if you compare that to how Blair tried to make the case for labour migration in the UK in the early 2000s, he was quite successful in the initial 3 or 4 years, but then quite swiftly different types of public philosophies, different ideas about immigration surfaced and crowded out the ideas about diversity and multiculturalism which he'd propounded. So that's again a story of a flip. So I don't want to be too optimistic about this, and I never think there are neat solutions to these things, but I'm just trying to tap into particular instances where that seems to have been effective for a number of years.
You might just have touched on it there towards the end of that last answer, but there was a significant spike in anti-immigrant sentiment in the UK in 2002, 2003. Could you explain what that was, just looking at the graph you had of that?
Ooh, okay. Where was that? That's interesting, isn't it? Because we associate the rise in net migration and with the 2004 enlargement, so the A8 accession and access to the labour market. And we tend to associate, in the literature, we tend to associate the rise in anti-immigrant sentiment as sort of occurring in the mid-2000s. Now, it might well be, and again, I mean, this isn't something which I've analysed in great depth myself, it might well be that this is reflecting concern about asylum. So at the end of the 90s, there was a substantial increase in number of asylum seekers to the UK, and that gained widespread media attention. So I would never associate myself with the position that a rise in whether it's net migration or asylum seeking leads directly or is directly correlated with a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, but where you have substantial media coverage for these sorts of trends, I think that can have a substantial impact on public opinion. So that might well be what accounts for that rise in. So did that answer your question? Yeah? So I think if it's towards the end of the 1990s, it might well have been, if you look at media coverage, you will see huge attention on asylum seeking.
Thank you. And there was a question in the center here?
Yes. Okay. Good night. You put a lot of emphasis on narrative and political leadership, but I was wondering if how you think echo chambers, fake news, and opinion bubbles kind of factor into this kind of thing. In the sense, what kind of obstacles they create as you have like this kind of backlash bias or confirmation bias in play, and how we can address that.
So your question, if I can just clarify, is about the role of fake news and confirmation bias in what sense?
It's mostly kind of, how do you factor in echo chambers and fake news and
right, so kind of social media dynamics.
Yes, just if you're talking about narratives and political leadership, they are kind of intertwined. Yeah. And yeah. We've seen kind of, especially in the rise of Trump, partly in Brexit, there was a new research by Pew Research Center, I think published a few days ago, when we've moved from a consensus and let's say values, shared values, towards two different kind of binomial distribution.
Yeah. So of course there's never one kind of narrative which everybody will buy into, and sometimes there's quite considerable conflict around competing narratives about social problems. But I'll give you one example of how effective a narrative can be. So look at the decision to set a net migration target in 2010. So that way of setting the target very much defined the issue as one of numbers, okay? Because you could meet the net migration target if you had, a million people immigrating every year and 1 million UK nationals leaving every year. So, I mean, it's a nonsensical target in the sense of addressing people's concerns. So the only way of really understanding the net migration target is in terms of a concern about overall numbers and overpopulation. So it's a kind of concern about overcrowding, etc. And by setting that net migration target, not only do you put the emphasis of the sort of channel social concern about immigration into that idea of overcrowding and aggregate numbers, you also, in a sense, abstract from or blur lots of important distinctions between different types of immigrants who are coming, different things, reasons why they come to the UK, different things that they do once in the UK, and different impacts of immigrants on different parts of the UK. So you just have one figure which is about the aggregate number who are present in the UK, or the net number present in the UK. Now, then you get this whole machinery of statistics produced every 3 months by the ONS with regular, predictable media coverage every 3 months of the net migration figures, because that's the target and that's how the government is assessed in terms of its achievements in migration policy, its performance. So you get this fixation on this one really narrow indicator of immigration, and in a sense that's a really good example of a narrative about immigration. It really shapes the way people think about what the problem is. Oh, it's numbers, it's rising numbers, and in a sense it abstracts from or glosses over some really important distinctions which otherwise might have been important if the target had been set differently. And that becomes, I wouldn't say that it's the only narrative in town around immigration, but it becomes really dominant, partly because of media coverage of this data, partly because of this dynamic of holding the government to account for a particular pledge, a particular promise, and because of the irresistible temptation by opposition parties to expose the government's inability to achieve this. Whether or not they agree with the target in the first place, this is a whole game of holding to account. You know, did you achieve your target or not? So these types of rhetorical interventions and these types of pledges have a huge effect on how we frame these types of issues. So notwithstanding the fragmentation in many cases of different narratives and the coexistence of competing narratives, especially in social media where we do have that fragmentation effect, I think it is possible to have a sort of a national level narrative which exercises real influence on the debate.
I'd like to pick up on media coverage. As a working journalist for 30 years or so, I've been seeing the UK national papers, all of them, for most days over that period. As a result of that the Brexit vote doesn't surprise me, attitudes to immigration don't surprise me, attitudes to ethnic minorities don't surprise me. There's been relentless negative coverage of those subjects across several of those papers. I suppose what remains a question is the extent to which those papers influence their readers and the extent to which they reflect the readers. So I just wondered what sort of importance you give to that media narrative over that long period.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very difficult, I mean, that's been puzzled over by immigration scholars and media scholars for decades. It's very difficult to work out the direction of influence, and it's probably two-way. So I think it's clear that the media, and when they select stories, the media is very much driven by what's newsworthy, so what will sell, what will appeal to its readers, and at the same time, its reporting has an influence on readers and so on. So it's a sort of iterative relationship. I think beyond that, I think the direction of causality is very, very difficult to pin down.
I think there was one hand here. Can that be the last question, please, just in view of the time, please?
Hi. So thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, you talk about the exposure of immigrants to the general population through like personal stories and the media, but I wanted to ask you your view on how and to what extent British TV and film shape views on immigration.
That's very interesting. So I think, I mean, I'm no expert on the role of more artistic types of dissemination on views and beliefs about immigration, but we know that TV, film, novels, other art forms and so on, by constructing really vivid narratives about these sorts of issues and in a sense pulling in and kind of creating different forms of empathy or very strong engagement, emotional engagement with these sorts of situations can have a very powerful effect. Beyond that, I'm afraid I'm not really qualified to say. It's not something I've looked into particularly, but it's clearly a very interesting issue.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure we'd all like to join in thanking Professor Boswell one last time.